There are 185 prisoners on death row in the state of Texas. This is part 2 of the series. Stephen STALEY, 61 years old, 32 years on death row. Robert Red, a manager of a steak and ale restaurant in Tarrant County, was kidnapped and fatally shot in 1991, and Stephen Kenneth STALEY was found guilty and given the death penalty. On October 14, 1989, the murder took place soon before the restaurant closed. According to the Texas Attorney General's office, STALEY, Tracy Duke, and Brenda Rayburn had committed crimes in 4 different states. STALEY was suspected of killing another escapee when he broke out of a Colorado prison a month earlier. Just after dining, the 3 drew their firearms and ordered the workers into a kitchen storage. The Attorney General's office reported that an assistant manager had escaped during the chaos and had dialed 911. When the police arrived, STALEY accused Red with activating a silent alarm. Red was held captive. STALEY, Red, Duke, and Rayburn climbed inside the vehicle and sped away. The police started chasing them and the car eventually broke down. Officers arrived and discovered Red had been murdered, and the 3 surrendered. Doctors testified that STALEY had paranoid schizophrenia, a kind of persistent psychosis, which the CCA ruling stated had been routinely diagnosed for nearly 15 years, and that his illness had worsened over time. STALEY was incompetent to be executed without medication. He could comprehend the charges clearly enough with medication to meet legal requirements. The court had to decide if STALEY could be administered drugs against his will in order for him to comprehend the situation and be put to death. Although the opinion held that there are situations in which forcible medicine is permissible, STALEY's case never included those situations being demonstrated. DARYL WHEATFALL, 58 years old, 31 years on death row. Following a dispute over $50, Wheatfall was found guilty of killing James Fitzgerald, 62 years old, and his wife, LB, 64 years old and disabled, in southeast Houston in December 1990. The Fitzgeralds were killed by Wheatfall and his co-defendant, McTerrell, when they went to their home to collect a debt from them. 3 headshots were fired at each victim. The couple's son was also shot in the stomach, but he pulled through and was able to testify in the case and pinpoint the offenders. Wheatfall broke into a crack house 2 days before the Fitzgerald killings and murdered one of the 3 persons he shot in the head. He then entered a garage where he stabbed 25 times a different individual. This man also passed away. In exchange for testifying against Wheatfall, McTerrell struck a deal and received a 50-year sentence. Brian Davis, 55 years old, 31 years on death row. The state of Texas handed down a death sentence for Davis for the murder of a man. According to court records, Brian Davis and his wife Tina McDonald, a female companion, met 31-year-old Michael Foster, a person with slight mental retardation, at a bar. The group returned to the victim's house. When they got there, Brian Davis killed the victim by stabbing him numerous times. 6 days later, Brian Davis and Tina McDonald carried out the same assault on a different victim, who this time managed to survive. Foster had promised the pair gas money in exchange for a ride home, angering Davis when he later informed them that he was out of cash. Although Davis initially admitted to the murder and accepted responsibility, he later withdrew the admission and claimed he was only attempting to save his wife. McDonald is serving 40 years after pleading guilty to aggravated robbery with a deadly weapon and auto theft for an offense a week after Foster was killed. William Mason, 69 years old, 31 years on death row. In 1992, Mason was found guilty of the murder of his wife, Deborah Ann Mason, and sentenced to death. Because his wife was playing her radio too loudly on January 17, 1991, he kidnapped her and beat her to death underneath the Highway 59 bridge over the San Jacinto River in Humboldt. This happened just 18 days after being released from prison for doing time for a murder and an attempted murder. With the deadly prison group known as the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, Mason had advanced to the position of captain. He was given a 55-year sentence for robbing and killing a black man in 1977, and he spent more than 10 years in prison. The couple had spent the morning with friends, drinking and smoking on the day Deborah Mason, 33 years old, was killed. He started beating her in front of their friends after they got into a fight. Deborah Mason was carried to the bridge where she was slain when the altercation got out of hand, and she was bound and gagged. Eugene Broxton, 68 years old, 31 years on death row. On June 3, 1986, as he was running away from a robbery, Broxton fired 2 shots at Pasadena police officer Walt Hayes. Hayes managed to escape, and shortly after that, he was able to catch his attacker in an apartment building. Broxton received a 13-year sentence after being found guilty on the charges of aggravated robbery and attempted murder. 4 years later, in 1990, he got parole. He broke into Gary Wayne Stuckwish apartment in Northeast Houston on April 6, 1991, and fatally stabbed the 46-year-old. Broxton stole the man's car after taking all of his possessions, but left it the very following day. Gordon John Miller, a 59-year-old TV guide salesman, was kidnapped by Broxton 13 days later in a location near Federal Road and I-10. Before escaping in his pickup, Broxton fatally stabbed Miller in front of witnesses. He made an attempt to attack Albert Madden, who escaped the assault 5 days later. In Pasadena on May 2nd, Broxton was detained for stealing a $20 radio from an East Houston Walmart. Due to the fact that the offense was deemed to be a minor infraction, prison overcrowding, and the fact that the authorities were unable to track down Broxton's parole officer at the time, he was just fined and released from jail. Broxton broke into the house of retired and disabled Albert Krieger, 64 years old, just 4 days later. He strangled him to death before reportedly pawning the victim's diamond ring. On May 10th, Broxton went back to the same Walmart where he had been detained for stealing the radio and took 65-year-old Gary Leon Andrews hostage while brandishing a rifle. Then, after robbing Andrews, the two of them drove to an isolated location where the man shot Andrews in the mouth and stabbed him in the stomach. Despite suffering severe wounds, Andrews lived. On May 16th, Broxton went to Channelview and saw the hotel room occupied by Waylon Dawkins, who was 23 years old, and Sheila Dawkins, who was 20 years old, a newlywed couple from Louisiana. By pretending to be a motel clerk, Broxton gained entry to the room. Once inside, he bound, gagged, pistol-whipped, shot them with his .44 Magnum, took their money, and left them for dead. Waylon, who had been shot in the head, lived. Sheila, who had injuries to the chest and arms, passed away. Broxton was sentenced to death for the murder of Sheila Dawkins. Since he received the death penalty in this situation, all the other cases were dropped. George McFarland, 63 years old, 31 years on death row. In 1992, a Harris County man was given a death sentence for the murder and robbery of a local grocery shop owner, 43-year-old Kenneth Kwan, who was shot dead as he returned to his business with a bag of $27,000 in cash from the bank. Although there was never any solid evidence linking McFarland to the murder, his lead attorney hardly prepared for the case, rarely spoke with co-counsel, offered no evidence, and even slept for significant portions of the trial. Regular customer Carolyn Barty, a civilian employee at the Houston Police Department, happened to be sitting outside and saw the entire shooting. She tentatively identified McFarland in a photo lineup, despite the fact that the shooter she initially described did not match the suspect. Not one of the suspected accomplices was ever detained or forced to give a testimony, and there were no prints or other tangible proof linking any of the suspects to the crime. 6 weeks later, McFarland was taken into custody when his teenage nephew called Crime Stoppers and claimed to have overheard his uncle confessing to a robbery. McFarland had a criminal history and a history of drug usage. However, after McFarland had already been placed on death row, the teen changed his mind and retracted his statement. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.